Hello, welcome back to Dadsplaining Politics.
Yeah, welcome back everyone. Hopefully the quality of our recording is not too bad. We're both in different places at the moment, so we're disconnected in terms of geography, but hopefully we find some connection in terms of our opinions today. So let's get started. Again, as usual, as is the pro quo, quid pro quo. I actually don't know if that's the right expression. For 2026, we are going to be talking about Iran and of course the US, because you can't talk about Iran without the US nowadays. And then we're going to be talking about Hungary and the recent Hungarian elections and what that means for the future of the EU and even for the mass far-right movements that have been spreading across the world in recent years. So do you want to start off with Iran and everything that's happening there?
Yes, absolutely. And we'll also touch on the altercations between Trump and the Pope, which is quite fascinating. All right, so the latest on Iran is there was the peace talks in Pakistan, led by the Pakistani president, where JD Vance went along together with all the senior officials from Iran. One of the quotes I saw was that all the negotiators from Iran have PhDs and quite advanced academic degrees from great universities around the world, whereas nobody on the American team has any sort of advanced degrees. They're real estate agents, etc., etc. So I just think it's a fascinating thing. Of course, JD Vance is a well-known author as well, I suppose. So
Yes, and that makes him professionally qualified to be at the negotiating table for two of
well,
the strongest armed countries in the world.
clearly not at the point because there hasn't been success. But anyway, they talked for supposedly 10 or 12 hours, and then the Americans left in a hurry and said the whole thing wasn't going to work. And so then subsequent to that, the US has decided to put an embargo on an embargo. So if you remember the Iranians, which is actually quite a good military strategy, the Iranians have said, we are controlling the Straits of Hormuz, and we'll only let oil tankers that are from friendly nations go through, and they'll have to pay a fee in order to go through, etc., etc. Now, what the Americans have done is they've said they're putting an embargo on all Iranian ports. So they're closing the Straits of Hormuz for everyone, for all tankers, etc. Now, this is a really good strategic move in my view, because China and many countries in Asia and many countries around the world are very much dependent upon oil from the Gulf. Now, if no oil is going through, that has several issues. That causes more extreme oil supply issues, particularly for the likes of China and others. It strangles all income to Iran. So this puts enormous pressure on the Iranian government. I was hearing the other day they had traditionally used the UAE to get lots of hard currency in, and lots of Iranian citizens were in UAE with schools and hospitals, etc. Anyway, UAE is super pissed with Iran because, of course, they attacked them, and they are shuttering those Iranian schools and hospitals, etc. So anyway, the money flow and the income via UAE is shut off. Now there's going to be no more oil, etc. So it could well be a good move by the US and hopefully bring the Iranians back to the negotiating table for some sort of diplomatic settlement, and perhaps China and others will get involved.
Yeah, definitely. I guess what you're saying as well is that they're using the language of, we can at least say China, and we're using the language of these other countries that haven't been wanting to engage on the diplomatic side of things. They've never really been part of that. When it comes to the world order, they've very much been focused on building their economies and not getting involved in, the overall peace and security of the entire world, as the US has often put themselves in that position. So yeah, you're changing the game. You're saying, hey, we're going to start using money to force you into the arena. We're not going to let you stay out of it or be impartial. If we're going to threaten your entire economy, we know that you have to get involved in some capacity, whether it's through military or simply like through economic sanctions themselves. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how they respond. I also think this is testing China. I would say it's a new era of them as a country. It's whether they want to take up the mantle as another influential power in the world. What do they do in this circumstance? Do they decide they're sick of the US imposing their policy upon everyone else and maybe stand in some way? I just wonder if there's a capacity that China would ever get involved. and they would ever threaten their military on Iran and the US to stop the war from continuing.
I can't see it, Freddie, because I think they feel like America has caused a huge problem for themselves, and they're sort of happily sitting back as long as they can to let America use all its weaponry and spend all its money, etc., etc. But this latest move by the US to shut off all oil exports to China and to Asia, many countries in Asia, the US is self-sufficient in this regard, so it's not a big issue for them. Right. So it's a smart strategic move, and it will be interesting whether it causes China to behave differently to the way they have historically.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is what I was saying as well. Like, even though you said you can't see it, I don't think we've ever been in a position like this before where China is being directly threatened by a conflict that is happening in the Middle East in such a way. So I wonder how long they'll just sit back and let it continue and threaten their economy. Because we're not just talking about the threat to the US or the threat to Iran. I agree that they don't care about the US and they don't care what happens to them and their reputation. I think they just care about themselves. But now that they are involved, what capacity do they want to be involved to? I just think it's an interesting question. But
And it is.
yeah, good strategy. I say if this other embargo doesn't work, then just do another one. Embargoes on embargoes on embargoes.
So the IMF was quoted the other day saying they're very concerned the world's going to go into recession because all of this is hugely impactful for economies around the world. So again, Trump will come under pressure from the electorate because Americans don't like paying higher prices. And, you know, the midterms aren't all that long away. So it'll be interesting what sort of pressure he feels. And clearly he does feel pressure given his recent behaviour, which is getting even more weird than ever.
Definitely. Look, and I think that in another episode we can focus on this more, but the divisions between MAGA are becoming very visible, I would say, even to just the average person. Ever since like Marjorie Taylor Greene really split away from Donald Trump and, you know, started opposing him publicly, I think that it's been interesting to see how they aren't falling for his America First rhetoric anymore. They're realizing that's not his true policy when he's getting involved in every other conflict across the world stage at the moment. We know that he doesn't truly care about America and the American people, and he doesn't truly want to disconnect America from the rest of the world. So I think that reality is just hitting a lot of people, and it's hitting a lot of Republicans as well. So it'll be interesting, of course, with the midterms, to see how the population responds, but also to see how the Republican representatives themselves respond to this policy that is not at face value what he promised to the country. It's the opposite of anything he ever promised.
No, exactly. It's really fascinating stuff. Just on the back of that, before we get on to Hungary, I'll just engage on this battle between Pope Leo and Trump. As those of you who may not know, Pope Leo is the first American Pope. Trump basically said on Truth Social that Leo's a weak person, and he doesn't understand, the need to get rid of nuclear weapons. And on top of that, he's also had a go at Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, who was his sort of closest ally after Viktor Orb in terms of European, and she's come out and said it's disgusting, his comments regarding the Pope, etc., which is obvious for any Italian Prime Minister. If they were to do anything different, it would be terrible. But Pope Leo has made some very interesting quotes recently and says he doesn't mind arguing with Trump. And he made this point, and I'll just quote him: "Enough with the idolatry of self and money. Enough with the display of power. Enough with war. True strength is manifested in serving." So he didn't mention Trump by name, but clearly it's targeted at Trump. And this is a very, very dangerous move by Trump, because there are 20 million Catholics in the US. And so, in fact, there's probably more than 20 million, or the number of 20 million I heard the other day, the ones who are members of the Republican Party, etc. So it's a much bigger number than that. So he better be very careful, because once he starts attacking the Pope, because within the Catholic Church there's this concept of infallibility of the Pope, okay, which everyone is taught that the Pope is infallible. okay, because he's the direct representative of God on earth. You see, many Catholics believe that, or maybe 20% of Catholics believe that. That's where I think the 20 million number was. There's 100 million, 200 or so million, and 20 million of those believe in the infallibility. Therefore, they're going to think God as being, Trump as being blasphemous, and et cetera, et cetera. Very interesting times.
Yeah, definitely. It is very interesting. I think that, it's quite an alarming move at the point where Trump obviously has no respect for religion in any capacity at all, to have gotten to the point that he's at, where the other day, right, he posted this AI created image of like Pope Leo bowing down to him and him putting his hand on Pope Leo's head and being like, I bless you. The level of ego that Trump has, I wish that psychologists were allowed to study him and to study how he became the person he is. Because exactly as Pope Leo said, the idolatry is something else. And the fact that you said he even referred to him as Leo, not simply as Pope Leo, he's so disrespectful to the structure of the church and the power and what it means to so many people. It's interesting. I don't think he respects any institutions as a whole. I think his disrespect of the Catholic Church kind of reflects that. He doesn't respect the institutions in America. He doesn't respect the institution of the Republican Party, I would even say, because he puts in whoever into really high-powered ministerial roles, whoever he feels would be best and whoever he feels would be most loyal. So he doesn't respect that institution. He doesn't respect international institutions like the United Nations, like the WTO. He doesn't respect the institutions of religion. And I honestly feel quite good right now. I feel like I've kind of hit on a point, is that I think he believes he's above all of this, all of these formulated institutions that humankind as a whole have come up with. He feels like he doesn't need to bow down to any of them. And that even includes the legal institution of America, the judiciary. So I think that if we observe his actions and his policy going into the future with this acknowledgement that he's never going to respect, tradition, and rules and legislature that's been put in place, then we'll understand his actions far better than we do now.
I agree, and I think it's very dangerous for him because if you think about the religious right, a big part of MAGA, they're not going to appreciate him making those sorts of comments about Pope Leo, even though they're not Catholic.
Of course.
They still respect that whole thing. And so let's move on to Hungary. So very exciting times that Viktor Orban has finally been defeated after 16 years in Hungary. So even after the assistance of J.D. Vance, or the non-assistance perhaps, and Marco Rubio visiting Hungary over recent times, and this is a very significant moment, not only for Hungary, but for the Western world, because Hungary was really, in a sense, the stooge, or Orban was the stooge of Putin, and actually made it very difficult for Ukraine over the last year or two. He would often veto aid packages of 90 billion euros or so to Ukraine. And so now that he is gone, and Peter Mayer is the new Prime Minister of Hungary, it should be very good news for Ukraine, very good news for Europe, and perhaps these right-wing populists can be defeated. Perhaps they're not as omnipotent as we considered them to be.
Yeah. Look, I don't know really what it means for the greater right-wing movement. I definitely think it means that people can be deposed. But at this point in time, Orban hadn't completely solidified his leadership, I would say. Obviously, he's been living in an illiberal, not very democratic state for a while now. So he's been in power in Hungary since 2010, when he rode a wave of protests against the government. I think he officially got the Soviets a long time ago out of Hungary, so he pushed for that. So he's had a huge role, I think, in Hungary and what it is now. And he, yes, has become very entrenched in the state and as a leader. But I think that this says something about his failure to dismantle the institutions of democracy you could almost say, because his party in the last few years has tried rigorously to remove free speech, to create their own media enterprises, which do spew like a certain type of propaganda into the public, meaning that it rids him of any opposition, it gets rid of any viable other party that could have a role at taking him away from power. So he actually did a fairly good job with this until Peter Magyar, until he broke away from Orban's party and decided to, start to be in his own party and run against him. And I think that's really what opened Orban up to criticism, because Magyar has similar ideology on a lot of the political spectrum, like Orban does, it meant that people were much more open to voting for him, I would say, than they would be open for voting for someone far more progressive and radical in the other direction. Peter Magyar identifies as, I think he is a conservative politician still. He's a centre-right politician. The one big difference though between the two of them is that he believes in the EU and the European Union. And yeah, as you said, he wouldn't stand in the way of Kiev accessing to the European Union. I think that he would likely support that. So it would be very, very interesting to see what happens going into the next few years. But yeah, I think that it just says something about Hungary's institutions and the fact that their democracy kicked someone out of power that the population simply didn't want there anymore.
Yes, it's wonderful news for NATO, wonderful news for the EU. And Orban in his campaign used lots of images of Zelensky and Ursula von der Leyen, etc. And clearly the populace has come to the conclusion EU is good. Zelensky's a good guy and they have a lot of respect for him. And so it was actually a terrible strategy when you think about it in the end. And Peter Magyar is young and is pro-Europe. So, and also I think there was also a feeling from what I read, huge amounts of corruption in Hungary, as usual, with often these populist leaders. And he tried to start dismantling elements of the state. And so Peter Magyar is going to have a long road to ensure Hungary comes back to this sort of more centre ground and a true participant of Europe, as opposed to someone complaining about Europe all the time and yet still being a member of Europe, right? So I got to think there's many European leaders who are very happy at the moment.
No, I definitely agree. It's just another huge asset to Europe, and it makes Europe stronger in general. Having a country like Hungary be part of the Union is a tremendous thing, and I think von der Leyen herself is probably feeling pretty good right about now. Because I think Hungary was the biggest weak point in Europe in the past few years. There were moments when Hungary had the leadership on the European Union floor for the 6 months or so. You know how it switches between countries over the years, and they had the floor, and that was a very dangerous position for Europe to be in, because Hungary under Orban had very different policies and opinions on the EU as opposed to the rest of the EU, as in they didn't really believe in democracy, they didn't believe in the union, they didn't believe in the economic free trade that they were part of. And this is just a huge change. The fact that they were benefiting from a system that they didn't believe in didn't go with EU's values. So it's just very convenient for the EU that now they don't have to deal with the problem of Hungary. And if they wanted to kick them out, that would have been a big head scratcher. So it's going to make their lives a lot easier.
And economically, Hungary's been struggling because the EU has withheld, I think I was reading, $9 billion of EU funding because Hungary wasn't playing ball. So that will all be released now. And so it's good news, because you think about Moldova recently voted in favour of EU, Hungary. Slovakia is still somewhat of a problem, but not to the same degree that Hungary has been. And it's also a lesson for these right-wing populists interfering in other people's elections, for the Americans, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. This never generally ends well, people interfering in other people's elections when you're not from there. There was the assumption, I think, that these right-wing populists is a global movement, and therefore people will be enthused if, Orban has a close relation with Trump, etc. But in fact, I think the opposite happened.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's important. And then I was also along those lines thinking about what this means for the right wing movement as a whole, like we were talking about earlier. And I think that this just gives us hope, right? It's saying that the general population, the average person, doesn't want a populist in power who only thinks of themselves. They don't want someone who's going to be insanely corrupt and take all the riches and run the country into the ground. Like the average person just wants to live an easier, more fulfilling life where they don't have to worry about politics to such a great extent. And this is the retribution from the people. They're getting their revenge because he hasn't listened to them for such a long time. The Hungarian people were obviously they were okay to deal with him for quite a while. He's been in power for 16 years, but he pushed it too far. He tried pushing authoritarianism on them in a very strong, in a very real way. And people said, no, this isn't what we're here for. So, yeah, it will be very interesting to see how America responds to this and how good of a job Trump has done in convincing the American populace that he is the populist leader that they want. Because I think at the end of the day, authoritarianism is very dangerous. If you're a very skilled leader, you could say like Putin, you can transform the country to work for you and you can stay in power forever. But if the people push back against you and they're strong enough, then you will be ousted as soon as you start getting too cocky. So that's what we've seen. And I think it's a really exciting day, regardless of Magyar's beliefs, regardless of the fact that he does have quite similar opinions to Orban on a lot of things. I think the fact that the EU is now in Hungary's side, so they're now back part of the community. I think the fact that they had an election which Orban was happy to concede is also an excellent thing, that he's not, ignoring the result and staying in power is a great thing too for their democracy. And yeah, it's a good sign going forward that democracy isn't failing. It still exists.
It's
Elections
also,
can still have an effect.
you're right. And it's also bad news for Putin because Orban was his key person in Europe supporting Russia. And in fact, I read that Russia had already prepared a social media campaign to dispute the election result had it been close. The fact that it was a landslide to Peter Mayer means that they didn't even execute on that plan because it would have had no credibility. So good news for Europe as a whole. Hopefully it will allow that funding to be released to Ukraine because, Ukraine really needs the help and Europe needs to really support its eastern flank and ensure that they're being strategic in that regard. Hopefully this is a positive wake-up call for Europe to start moving a little more quickly as well.
Yeah, hopefully it is. Because what excuses do they have in saying they're not united? They're as united as they're ever going to be, probably, at this point in time. I don't think it's going to get much better. So they need to take this opportunity and run with it and stand united against Russia now that they don't have anyone holding them back.
Yep, absolutely. Anyway, Freddie, that's probably it for today. Lovely chatting with you again. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode
Lovely
and
chatting with you.
we will see you soon.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you for listening to our funny personal opinions. And yeah, we'll see you next week, guys.
Bye.
Bye.